Hello and welcome to the Varn Blog. And today I'm here with Glenn McDorman, one of the three founders of Claytemple Media. How many people were originally involved, Glenn?
Yeah, three were originally involved. We're expanded out now to five people, though. There's still really the three core are probably the most active.
Yeah. Now I discovered you through the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast. Was that in Agnes your first shows or?
Yeah, we launched three shows all at the same time, or roughly the same time, the same semester is what I'll say. It was the fall of 2017. And we launched Agnes, which was a solo show that I was doing in which I interviewed scholars in the fields of late antique, medieval, and Byzantine studies. And then we launched the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast around the same time. And then we also had started our Star Trek show, which began life as a Star Trek Discovery show, looking at the brand new Star Trek show that was streaming on the internet in the autumn of 2017. We've did the first two seasons of that show on an episode by episode basis, and then switched into covering classic Star Trek instead.
Um, I'm sure you went over this in the show, but for my listeners, why would you stop covering Discovery, Glenn? Um,
Well, there were a number of reasons why. One of them was simply that it just wasn't on the air that much.
mhm.
They could come on and did 13 episodes and then took a year and a half to do another season. That was one of the reasons. But the big thing is that what happened in between the second season and the third season is that my wife and I had a baby. And it turned out that doing a sort of live response to an currently airing TV show, where if the TV show airs, say, on Sunday night, and you want to get a podcast episode out, say, Tuesday morning to be current, that was not going to happen with a baby, it turned out. So that was the real big reason.
So we're really here to talk about the two shows that came later, uh, Elder Signs and ATOS. And um, I have to remind myself that ATOS is not Elder Signs. I listen to both in the I think I listen to your master Claytemple feed more than I do the individual shows. So um, there oftentimes we're like, yeah, Brandon's on the ATOS sometimes too. It's all the same shit, but it's not. ATOS is a much broader prerogative and also covers longer text generally, right? Like you read a lot of
Right.
text.
Yeah. Elder Sign is our weird fiction show, though we have a very broad definition of what weird fiction is, but it is also focused on short fiction with a few exceptions. Whereas ATOS was, the idea behind ATOS was that maybe we should do a podcast also that looks at some novels in smaller chunks rather than taking 2 years to read through a Gene Wolfe novel, for example. And so, yeah, ATOS is all of speculative fiction. So that's, the publishing categories of fantasy and science fiction and horror, and looking at novels. But the episodes are meant to be about 20 to 30 minutes. The idea being that, maybe you've never even heard of the book that I'm covering that month, but you can listen to me talk about it for, the duration of a commute to work and know a little bit about what that book is. I try to tell you what happens in the book, what the setting, who the characters are, but also what some of the themes and the motifs are, give a little taste of the writing. It's kind of an audio cliff notes, I suppose.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this in regards to there's a couple of shows that do what you do. I think the oldest one used to be the HP Lovecast Literary Podcast. I think they're now Strange Studies of Strange Stories. Um, and you guys, and I then, as we were talking about before before we started recording, also a couple of uh, Gene Wolfe specific podcasts. There's other authors again. There's a bunch of like Stephen King only shows that go through the same thing. But what I like about your show and about Strange Studies of Strange Stories is I actually discover new fiction from it. So unlike Cliff Notes, where you're reading Cliff Notes because you're trying not to read a book, um, I'm often listening to your show to find what my pleasure reading is going to be. I read a fair amount, and I still try to read for fun. Um, and back in the days where MFAs actually tried to pretend that they did something different than genre fiction, I was trained to distrust and shame genre fiction. I will say that I don't feel like that attitude is actually prevalent in MFAs anymore, particularly because there's a lot of genre fiction writers with MFAs now. But it I realize that even though I have an English degree and I'm very well read, that when it comes to contemporary speculative fiction, I just have huge decades long gaps. Like, and your show in particular, ATOS, is a good place for me. Like, I don't know much about classic sci-fi outside of Asimov. Like, need to read some more of that. I don't know that much about weird fiction of the 20s, except for the big weird fiction of the 20s. Like, everybody knows Lovecraft and Howard, but there's a lot of other interesting writers out there that I didn't know anything about. And there's a lot of bad stuff that you also have to slog through. And I often feel like your show slogs through some of it for me, so I don't have to read every story in the Mammoth Weird Fiction book, being really bored through parts of it. But I have discovered authors through you, and also podcasts through you, actually, when you sometimes have guests on Elder Sign. So Elder Sign's like, I think, the show now that's really the most listened to, isn't it?
It is our flagship show at this point.
Yeah. So how is that gone? I know you guys record for Elder Sign almost like a year in advance. And I know that because I'm a Patreon subscriber, and often I listen to on that show because I listen to both feeds. I'll be like, did I listen to this? Oh yeah, they recorded this forever ago, and I got it really early on the Patreon feed. But let's listen to it again because I don't remember it anymore. And it's actually very convenient that way for you, because the distance between when the early release is and when the public release is long enough that I actually benefit from listening again. But I've discovered a lot. Like, I think there was who's that? It's a female writer who wrote a story about cancer from the 80s. I think she wrote in the 70s and 80s.
Are you thinking of Lisa Tuttle?
Yeah, Lisa Tuttle. I discovered her through you and then Paperbacks from Hell. Like, and there's been all kinds of stuff I've discovered, and I think that's partly because you guys take Patreon requests and commissions. For a while I was trying to get people to vote for Reggie Oliver, since I guess I'm one of the only people who really likes Tatarist press horror. But that means with Elder Signs, there really is kind of the classics are usually included because people vote for them or because they're already there. But also there's legitimate stuff that you guys read that I have barely heard of or never heard of. And that's, I think, partly because of the audience throwing in suggestions for you reading.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. We're at a point now where Elder Sign for sure, and ATOS also, actually, the content that we do on both of those shows is entirely driven by our listeners. They decide what we're going to do, and so Lisa Tuttle was new for me as well. I probably had read something or other of hers in an anthology at some point in my life, but didn't engage with it, in any way that I afterwards went and found her work. But boy, love that story that a listener had us do. And so, yeah, that's a really awesome thing that we get a really awesome feature of doing the story selection the way that we do and having such really awesome and dedicated listeners, is that we're also on a journey of discovery along with the audience. And that's very cool. Every once in a while, we do get to go check out a story or do an episode on a story or a novel that we both know really well, but that's actually become really rare. Makes that, a kind of a special treat on its own. That's really fun. And I will say publicly on your show, Derek, that we are going to be doing that Reggie Oliver story for you. I won't subject listeners to my mouse clicks, but it is either going to be January or April of next year, I'm pretty sure, is when that will be out. We haven't recorded it yet, but it is upcoming on our recording schedule, I assure you.
Awesome. I am super excited about that. I'm always trying to spread the gospel of British weird horror, in Tatarist press in particular. I think the only Tatarist press author that I think is well read in America is probably Angela Carter. But I'm always talking about Reggie Oliver and Mark Valentine, and everyone's like, who? And I'm like, they're British. They're pretty
Yes,
darn
and
good.
one of the things that I do enjoy about how we do the story selection is that we take nominations from listeners and then we run it through a vote of listeners, and probably there's some kind of scholarship to be done on the results of those votes in terms of demography, but definitely British writers from the middle part of the 20th century do not get voted for. We get a lot of nominations for them. We know that we have a lot of individual listeners who are very passionate about people like Reggie Oliver, Angela Carter, Robert Aikman, uh, just to name a few, but they don't generally fare all that well on the ballots for some reason. That we always end up doing them. There's going to be more Angela Carter coming up on this month's ballot, actually. So, or no, that's not true. But in 2 months hence, an upcoming ballot, and we'll see how that goes. But we have done one Angela Carter story by request, and it was amazing. And so I hope that we do get to cover more of her as well.
So, I mean, one of the things about this that's different. We were talking about this on air. When you just off air, when you started with Gene Wolfe, you decided to approach it the traditional chronological way. Uh, when you guys came out, were you the only Gene Wolfe podcast, or
We were not. When we started recording episodes, we were. But as you hinted earlier, we sit on our episodes for a long time, and so we didn't release the show until we had. I think we when we began publishing the show, we had 10 episodes that we released all at once. We published them all at once, and then had a bank of about a year's worth of episodes behind that. So during the time that it took us to record all of those episodes, Al Zebo Soup had gotten on the air with a very different agenda in terms of what they were going to cover, but also a very different approach to what they were interested in about Gene Wolfe. And Gene Wolfe is I mean, he's just a genius. He's a literary genius who cranked out masterpiece after masterpiece. So there is plenty of room for lots of people doing all sorts of scholarship and other ways of engaging with his work. And the Gene Wolfe fan community is just spectacular.
yeah, it's a highly devoted fan community. I think partly because Gene Wolfe is so brilliant, and partly because Gene Wolfe is gently sadistic with his audience, and you kind of have Stockholm syndrome, just trying to figure it all out. I One thing I love about Gene Wolfe, and I use Gene Wolfe a lot on this point, is I think Wolfe has a reputation because he's so Catholic, of being a hyper conservative. Um, I like pointing out to people by going through, particularly a lot of his earlier novels, not the first one, which I only know about really because of you guys. So, because that novel's hard to get. But um, that you should not read or not read an author based on your perception of their politics, because yeah, I mean, yeah, I understand if you think you're giving money to an objectively bad person, that's a different thing. But with Gene Wolfe, I find that, say, Fifth Head of Cerberus or parts of a Book of the New Sun are hyper aware of issues that would be considered pretty left wing, and but in regards to gender relations, in regards to um, colonialism, comes up in almost all of his work in this interesting way, and in a way that I didn't realize how central it was to his thinking until actually you guys started covering peace, because it's a big, huge part of peace that when I read that novel, I didn't really pick up. Admittedly, peace is a lot to put together because it's so time displaced. But um, what other trends have, like, going through his work like that, and we'll talk, I would go back to elder signs, but going through his work like that, what have you learned about Wolfe from going chronologically and dealing with his work in that way?
Well, sticking with the theme that you brought up, and also the theme of the show that you do, we've been very interested in Wolfe as someone who's writing political speculative fiction, largely
Mhm.
political science fiction, which is just a really wonderful and really massive subgenre of science fiction with masterpieces like Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein, and loads of others. Maybe Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury is probably the other really popular example of that. And Woolf in the late 60s and really throughout the 70s writes a lot of stories that engage with speculation about politics, engage with political philosophy, political ideology, and it is certainly in The Fifth Head of Cerberus, and it is also all over Peace as well. And charting his engagement with the current events of the 60s and 70s has been really interesting. But I think something else that's been really interesting is that Gene Wolfe is in some ways something of a case study in the history of American political ideologies. You yourself said that Wolfe is often regarded as being politically conservative, though anytime an interviewer would ask him about his political leanings, he would say that I'm more something along the lines of I'm conservative on some things, liberal on other things, and I'm not really anything that anyone ever tries to peg me down as being. Also, my characters aren't always speaking for me, right? um, and so it's been interesting to look at Gene Wolfe, his stories as an example of actually the changes in political ideologies from the 1960s to now. What constitutes conservative? What constitutes liberal, or what constitutes right wing versus left wing? Where do those ideologies map onto? One of the things that I think we found most interesting is that, given that the sort of public consensus is Gene Wolfe is politically conservative, his very first science fiction novel, very first novel at all, which is 100% a political science fiction novel, is all about how we should have universal basic income, which doesn't show up in conservative discourse at all in the United States, but was at least mildly talked about in the last Democratic presidential primary season, at least a little bit because of Andrew Yang, but just doesn't come up at all as a conservative agenda. But there it was, as in fact being championed as a policy that would be good for libertarians, something that libertarians should want to be in favor of.
There's something so interesting about a couple of his major ideas. One thing he seems to do that I also don't generally link with conservatism almost of any period is the idea of expanding what we consider sapient and what might be, from Gene Wolfe's perspective, and sold way beyond what most people would do. I mean, what counts as a person in Gene Wolfe is often robots, genetically hybridized animal people, trees. If you get into the Book of the Long Sun, it's like, well, there are plant people, and Gene Wolfe seems to grant all these people personhood in a serious sense, and that's an interesting challenge. It's not something that I would associate with. I mean, even a very Catholic writer, definitely a conservative writer. That's interesting. And I realized that Gene Wolfe views on gender relations are probably the issue he gets criticized the most of. And I think rightly in some cases where the ambiguity is just too hard to figure out what's going on. I think the Jolenta in the second book of the New Sun is one of these famous instances where you can go back and forth on what is actually even meant by what happened. And it's unfortunately one of the issues where I think Wolfe is too vague. But in a lot of his work, I think a lot about the women in Fifth Head of Cerberus, where the women are portrayed in ways that are not flattering, but the underlying context is like, it is because society has given them no other option, and this is why they're acting that way. And that's almost explicitly stated, as much as Gene Wolfe explicitly states anything. But yeah, I find that fascinating, and I find that fascinating when you go through his work. And now we can pivot over to Elder Sign, to the kinds of politics and ideas of early, middle, and contemporary speculative fiction and weird fiction. I think weird fiction has a reputation mostly because of its origin in the pulps in the 20s as being a somewhat reactionary uh, genre, as opposed to like science fiction, which is supposed to be a progressive genre. Um, and what I've gathered from your show, from another show I listened to called Appendix N, which I discovered through your show, actually. um,
Right.
they've
I
been,
had one of the hosts on as a guest host on Elder Sign, which was a fantastic episode. Absolutely, a lot of fun. Appendix N is awesome. People should definitely be listening to that show.
yeah, that was, and what I discovered from going through those, that work is, one, the idea that a lot of people in a lot of the more reactionary people in speculative fiction has, that it was not political in the early 20th century. They're just wrong. And two, the political allegiances are way more all over the place, by genre and by time period, than I think people realize. There's actually less consistency um, than I would have thought. Uh, Even in the stuff in the 50s and 60s, which I always expect, and maybe early 70s, which I always expect to have a Cold War undertone, they don't all. Uh, they're not all like pro U.S. In fact, very few of them are pro U.S. capitalism. Actually, it's quite interesting. So, how has it been? You were talking about the difference between the Gene Wolfe show, which you've gone through systemically. You hadn't even got to the most famous Gene Wolfe book shit. I think you've gotten to my favorite Gene Wolfe book now, which is Peace. And then, in 1,000 years, when you're releasing episodes after you're dead, and maybe your children are curating
Yes.
your archive, and you get to like the land across. People who know Gene Wolfe know why I'm laughing about that.
Yeah.
You might be able to make sense of it.
Yeah, we'll see. Brandon and I have both had kids since we began the show. It was in large part because we knew that we weren't going to make it to the end, and we were going to need someone to take over. So we're beginning that process now. Kids are very young; they can't read yet, but we're working on it. But
Yeah.
no, you're right. It's a very different approach to how we do Elder Sign, which is totally anachronic, where we just bounce around through time, especially now that we're doing whatever listeners are having us do. So one week we might be reading something from the 19th century. The next week we might be reading something that's uh, only a few years old, and then we do a lot of stuff in between as well. And we just bounce around. We never quite know what we're going to be doing from week to week. I mean, we have a schedule, but there's no scheme there, is what I mean. And that's actually been rewarding in another way, right? Because it keeps us on our toes for one thing, and also lets the stories be surprising and lets us continue to go to them without an agenda or without some preformed ideas about what we're going to expect from, say, a writer in this or that demographic in this or that decade. Well, this story is probably going to engage with these three themes. This is probably where this person falls on the political spectrum. We don't get stuck in that very often, and I think that that's been pretty enlightening. And as you say, in the 1920s, the writers of the 20s and the early 30s, especially Lovecraft and Howard, are often considered to be very politically conservative, and that's
I would
not
say maybe even
necessarily,
reactionary.
yeah, reactionary, right? I think that is the word that you used, and that's not entirely wrong, but it's also not the complete picture of who they are, or at least where they are in the political spectrum, and that's been interesting to discover in their stories as well. Very surprised to discover actually quite a bit of support for progressive social policies in the work of H.P. Lovecraft. He doesn't come out in favor of universal basic income the way that Gene Wolfe does in his early fiction, but supports ideas like that. He's very much in favor of financial support for artists and so on. But then at the same time, he does turn around and have a pretty restricted idea of who should qualify for those things, who should be counted as American and that sort of thing. And so it's interesting again to see the ways that our own ideologies have changed over time, what it means to be conservative, what it means to be liberal or reactionary or progressive, but also just to see that in the past, especially, I think that there was a lot more on the menu than just left or right, the way that
Mhm.
our news media wants us to pick these days, because, for them, their business is to sell it to us, sell politics to us like it's a sporting event. And so they have crafted this idea of, you're either over here or you're over there. But 100 years ago, these writers had a lot more menu options, and they really ordered a la carte as well. And that's been interesting to see.
Yeah, I think people talk about the narrowness of American politics, but I've always been like, it's kind of the narrowness of post 1980s uh, media driven politics. It's definitely true in America, but one of the other things I've noticed about being around the world is places like Canada and the UK, any place that shares anything like a media market with us, even if it's not explicit, their politics looks a lot like ours over time, even that have completely different origins and a completely different constitutional arrangement. Like, and I do think it is misleading to read even people from the 1980s in the purview of our contemporary notions of what is and is not okay. I think one of the most strange examples of that, to get into a recent controversy, was Mercedes Lackey, who's a controversy around her uh, using an off-color word to refer to Samuel Delaney that was totally acceptable in the 70s, and she got kind of, to lack of a better word, canceled, by not by the community actually, and not even by other authors. It was mainly by people afraid of lawsuits and the conference attendance, like HR. But it's been interesting to see, because on one hand I get why people might be upset about that, and I don't want to actually say that there's no reason to be. On the other hand, I'm like, this person was incredibly progressive for their time period and also took a risk. I mean, they were a queer author and a female author in speculative fiction at a time where both were very rare. Um, and they weren't totally, unlike some prior authors before them, uh, anonymous about all that. I mean, and Sam Delaney also is like that. I mean, you think about Samuel Delaney and, queer black man writing speculative fiction. Some of the weirdest speculative fiction actually in the person's novels that I've ever read. Um, and and yet, interestingly, I'm actually surprised he's not more read. I mean, he seems like people reference him all the time, but I don't feel like I've heard a lot of people discuss his stories. You guys, I believe you guys did a couple of Delaney stories. Or you
We
did?
have you and you as a very generous Patreon supporter have had access to them, but they've not been released publicly
Okay.
yet. But they will be in 2023, and we're very excited about that. And I have his novel Babel 17 on my list of ATOS shows to do. So that'll probably be 2024 or something like that. I'm way ahead on those. And Brandon, my co-host on Elder Sign and the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast, went to Temple University. That's where
Hmm.
his undergraduate degree is from, and was in the creative writing program that Sam Delaney teaches at, or at least taught at the time. And so we have wanted more reasons to cover him for a long time, and it's been really really awesome that we've been able to. And in fact, Brandon actually has been on a panel with him at our local con here in Philadelphia, PhilCon, which was just super cool. I mean, Brandon is just some guy who reads stories and talks about them on the microphone with me, right? But then now he's talking about what a masterpiece 2001 is, on a panel with Sam Delaney. Just very cool. It was cool to be in the audience for that.
Yeah, I think I read Dahlgren when I was in my MFA program, and it blew my mind. Like, um, that's what my window into weird fiction was actually new sci-fi of the 70s, which I discovered uh, kind of because I kept on noticing this was in the aughts, where we were still pretending that like science fiction was not totally a literary genre, although we were beginning to stop that. But that was when, like, Margaret Atwood was very pronouncedly talking about how she wrote speculative fiction and not sci-fi or horror or whatever. And so the safe place to start was with people like Phil Ditch, and if you had a vintage or if you had a vintage release or a New York Review of Books release, it was like okay. But that was my mirror in, and then Lovecraft. I think in 2000 and what was it 2008 2009 where he got the Library of America release, and then it became okay to talk about Lovecraft, even although then immediately people had to deal with his politics, which had not really been dealt with. I don't think. I mean, Josie and others have written about it, but one thing I like about your show is you don't shy away from that, but it's not the primary function of your show. Like you do discuss it. You don't. You're not afraid of talking about when someone's politics seems egregious, but it doesn't come up. I mean, it actually surprisingly doesn't come up a whole lot. And when you guys have done discussions, and again, I listen to the Patreon feed, so I don't remember if this is available to the public or not.
Not worried about you spoiling anything. So
right. But like a bunch of Robert E. Howard stories that you guys have covered throughout the years, and how complex. This is something that I've encountered too. Like I thought Robert E. Howard stories were going to be completely and totally racist. In obvious ways that made it like about some of the Lovecraft stories where racism is really what's driving the story even. And I see the racism in some of it, but I also see a lot of other stuff. There's a very complicated view about non-European, non-civilized people in Howard, and sometimes his racism is just as much romanticizing as any like white supremacy notions or anything like that. And that actually did surprise me when I discovered that reading a lot of his stuff in chronological order. And then I also discovered some of the worst stuff and some of the most offensive stuff actually has other authors who've edited it and added stuff in. So art stories where they've they've turned X early story into a Conan story, and it really doesn't work because you've added some weird elements to it. Which is not to say that he wasn't racist. I mean, he's from Texas in the turn of the century. There's almost no way. But that he's more interesting than that, actually. And I think lately there seems to have been a rebirth of scholarship about him, and kind of unlike Lovecraft, where there's been kind of like his reappraisal and then a strong backlash. With Howard, it seems like it's actually gone kind of the other way. It's been a reappraisal and then people going, oh, this is not as bad as I thought it was. Parts of it are still bad, but it's a lot more interesting and a lot more complicated, and his views are fascinating. I mean, like I think about the Solomon Kane stories and like the way he portrays Africa, and I'm like, yeah, that's actually, that doesn't read to me like a person who thinks Africans are subhuman. Like it's not gonna exculpate him for some of his views, but it's also like it's not nearly as, I don't know. It's like watching Disney movies from the '60s is often more offensive. Like
both Howard and Lovecraft subscribed to what we now label scientific racism, which in a really simplistic way is the idea, the belief that something about your body, something inherent in your biology, dictates who you are, dictates what sorts of things you like to eat, dictates what type of clothing you like to wear, your culture, essentially, right? And also, of course, your aptitudes and abilities. And this grows out of the scientific revolution, the more pertinently, really, the Enlightenment, this move to classify and categorize everything. And then, of course, out of Darwinism as well. And so by the time we get to the early 20th century, almost everybody on the planet believes in scientific racism in one way or another. And it is at the core of Nazi belief and is really a big part, anyway, of the foundation of the Holocaust. But it's been an insidious belief, even for people who would, if asked, say they don't subscribe to that, or who certainly would say that they don't believe or support bigotry or racism in any way, and in fact are actively anti-racist. Nonetheless, will still default to speaking in scientific racist terms when they're not consciously thinking about it. And this is where I like to go to Star Trek, actually, as a great example of this. Star Trek
Mhm.
is explicitly a progressive show, has always been explicitly an anti-racist show from the 1960s on. This was, from its inception, this was part of Gene Roddenberry's agenda. I'm going to show a vision of the future that is anti-racist, among other things, a progressive vision of a future, an optimistic future that we could have, that we need to think about here in the chaos of the 1960s. And that is at the core of Star Trek. Nonetheless, Star Trek all the time uh, treats aliens as if their bodies are their culture, their biologies are their culture. All Klingons are angry people, not because this is something they've learned through their culture, but because of their bodies. And so you'll get all sorts of Star Trek episodes where we have a half human, half Klingon person. What if we split them into two? Well, now the human person is not an angry person, and the Klingon person is even angrier than there's ever been, and that's only because of the biology. Yet, if you ask Star Trek writers if they believed in scientific racism, they would say absolutely not. And so it's a really insidious belief system that I think is for anyone, I think, born in the 20th century, I think still have some of that latently just in the culture that we grew up in and have to interrogate that. And so one of the things that we try to do on the show is one, just to keep that in mind. But also, I am a trained historian, university instructor for my day job, and although my research focus is on 1500 years ago, people who lived 1500 years ago on another continent, in fact, nonetheless, anytime I'm reading anything, I approach it through a historical lens, and so I try not to read things with the purpose of morally judging the people who wrote them, but with a genuine curiosity to understand their worldview. Uh, but we also try not to shy away from saying that we don't subscribe to this worldview. We're not advocating it as we're discussing it, and also to condemn things where they need to be condemned. And of course, the closer we get in our own time, and when we're dealing with American writers, perhaps most especially, that becomes more and more pertinent. And so it's actually been difficult and tricky for us to cover Howard and Lovecraft from time to time. One of the ways that we work on the show is that we actually try not to talk to each other about what we're reading until we get live on the microphone. Every once in a while, if it works really long or we've got a tight recording window, we might pass some notes around, or outlines just to keep us on track. But for the most part, we try to come in cold, not knowing what the other's thinking. But when we do Howard and Lovecraft, we often have to break that rule because we need to have a meta conversation ahead of time about how are we going to deal with this depiction of a black person? How are we going to deal with the use of this term here? Where do we want to put that in the conversation? How much do we want to foreground that? What do we want to do with this? And it's not always a fun challenge to have, but I also think that it's well worth doing, right? That engaging with these writers who remain immensely popular and really looking at their thought, really trying to contextualize it, but also not hiding some of the brutal ugliness there is important for our culture to do.
I think it's super helpful to think about that. I think I didn't. One of the things about the whole scientific racism notion and how much it pervades, I actually think I started thinking about it uh, in regards to Tolkien, um, who is often, uh, I think, uh, given a pass by some people, but also maybe unfairly demonized by others because of the kinds of associations made that he's doing with species and species returning to national myths and this that, and the other. Um, One of the things I find fascinating about that is that I always like to remind people, while I think it's true, a lot of the critiques people make about Tolkien. I mean, he was a fairly conservative Catholic in a lot of ways. Um, that when people read him, they should also remember that he thought he was writing something that was particularly in regards to Lord of the Ring, that was partly about World War I and World War II and dehumanization and industrialization and imperialism. And so it's I'm like, so on one hand, a lot of things that you guys feel and say about this is correct, and I think it's fair, and we need to acknowledge that. On the other hand, I think we also have to put it in the context of its time. If you go off and say that like Tolkien was a Nazi, which I've heard people say, and I'm like, these problematic things actually do not necessarily equate to this political belief at this time period, particularly from somebody who thinks that they are writing an anti-fascist allegory almost explicitly. So, and Tolkien's not usually into allegorical writing, but in so much that there is allegory in Lord of the Rings, part of it is that Sauron and Saruman are Nazis, like, and they're engaging in explicit eugenics, etc., and so forth. And so I think about that as a double-edged sword. I don't do this as a public figure much, because I actually don't delve in popular literature that much on my show. But as a teacher, I deal with this all the time because I teach literature. It's what I do. And like, I teach Shakespeare. And if you want to go into trying to decouple and figure out what would have been, like, what is culturally problematic to us now, what is specific to the play, what is a trope in the play, why would this come up? It's a lot of work, and it's a lot for students to do. It's usually, I find Shakespeare useful as actually a way to introduce that to students, because it's so far removed from their lives, even linguistically, that they know they kind of have to, and they know they're going to encounter things that make them uncomfortable. But then they're often surprised by what else is in there, and early modern social attitudes are not what they thought they were. You're confusing them with Victorians, and Victorians didn't really behave that way either, but that's what they wanted you to think they behaved like. So, fun stuff like that. And so I wrestle with that a lot with a lot of this literature, particularly in the early 20th century. And I also used to wrestle with stuff like representation in literature. I sat down once, was writing a philosophy curriculum in Mexico with a female colleague of mine, and she was like, I want to find ancient female philosophers. And I was like, there are about 4 that we know anything about, and we don't have their work. And I'm glad you want to teach them. I think it's important that you do. Here's who you can mention, but we don't have text, and we really don't have a lot of significant female philosophers until probably the Middle Ages, actually. In the West, and in India and stuff, it's a little different, but not much. So it's an interesting historical problem, because on one hand, I definitely want to help people find representations. On the other hand, in some of these time periods, it doesn't really exist. Like the social codes were as such that it did not happen. So, the historical, I want to ask you about that though. You're a historian, and it's a very big part of your show. If you listen to a lot of your stuff, the historical elements come out a lot, even now that Agnes has been retired, and whatnot. How does that inform your reading of all this literature, and what is there tension between your historical training and then being kind of an ad hoc literary scholar?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is. One of the things that I really benefit from, of course, is that on the main show, the flagship show, Elder Sign, I'm not the only host, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I get some great balance and pushback from Brandon that I think is a dynamic that's really fruitful. And but as far as how it informs, how my historical background, my historian background really informs my approach to the text, in some ways, I think the way that I used to just read novels for fun as a kid is actually what led me on the path of becoming a historian. It turned out that I was always reading stories as if they were artifacts from some other civilization that I was trying to figure out. So, I would read The Hobbit or The Chronicles of Narnia, or I don't even Bunnicula, as if, these were imaginary worlds that I could really access and wanted to know all sorts of things that the writers of these books didn't really want me to know about, like how do taxes work, uh, how are laws published, how are court cases decided, what are property rights like, all of those sorts of things that I was super interested in, like the world building. How does the world work? And so that's an approach that I always take to the fiction as we're reading. But then I think having some historical training, especially as trained as an institutional and social historian, as I have been, it's actually really a really useful toolkit for talking about texts that are 70 years old, 50 years old, 100, 150 years old as we run the gamut on the show, and enabling us to, apply those types of tools to pulp stories published in pulp magazines, and to mine them as primary sources for understanding the world of the 1920s or the 1930s, or look at, serialized fiction of the 19th century, and do the same thing. But also even to turn around and do the same thing for a story published a few years ago in our own lifetime, at a time when I was here too, watching well, I mean, not watching the news, but reading the news on the internet and listening to news podcasts and so on, and to read them through that lens, I think is actually a really useful approach to the stories that that you don't get a lot of in English scholarship, because it's not the way that English departments work. And I would say that on the flip side too, that I think actually some of the best works of historical scholarship that I've read lately, things that have really changed the way that I've thought about this or that period or episode or something like that, have come from people outside of the historical discipline. Um, for example, I mean, you mentioned Shakespeare, who I adore. There are some really, really marvelous books on Shakespeare's world by Shakespeare scholars that feel very different than what early modern British historians are doing. And I find that so refreshing. And so, to that extent, there's some interdisciplinarity inherent in the show. And interdisciplinarity, I think, is something of a buzzword in academia, but it is actually a really, really useful tool. And Brandon and I get to do a little bit of that on the show. And to the extent that we're, engaging in scholarship by just talking into the microphones rather than, publishing words in peer reviewed journals. I think that we are doing something that's useful and helpful for people.
Yeah, I think I had a long conversation with an editor yesterday, and I should be careful myself. Don't know when these are going to come out in what order, but uh, so listeners, I apologize if I am talking about a conversation you haven't heard yet. Um, about similar, I mean, I talk about why I left academia, so you are still kind of in it. I guess kind of in it's not, but you're still in it. I left academia because I, as a humanities academic, had this realization when I was living in Korea, working at a university there, that I had published blog posts that would have 50 times the readers of anything I'd ever done as a scholar, and that uh, 90 something percent of all humanities research is not cited. So it's like there's no evidence anyone read it, other than the three reviewers for your 3 or 4 anonymous reviewers for your peer review, and between that and low money, and then realizing I was of the wrong generation to ever get tenure, I actually decided to go back to being a high school teacher. I think I'm one of not the only people I know who's done that, but it's not a common trajectory. But it's for similar reasons. I mean, what reasons I do this show is political engagement, political education, but I have a broader mission on purpose. And the broadness of the mission is because I think there's a lot of really important, really interesting ideas that are kind of cordoned away in academia, are obscure political this or that, and are niche parts of literature even, and that they need to be exposed to the public. And while I don't have a huge audience, I can guarantee some of these things are probably going to get more of a hearing than they would have and by non-specialists anywhere else. And I do think that interdisciplinarity is great. That is a buzzword in academia, as you're right. It's also one that I believe academia almost uniquely fails at, to be quite frank. Because I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Look, I've known a ton of PhDs in my life, and I know many of them are not particularly intellectually well-rounded. They know everything about their subject area, but that's often about it. And it is good, I think, to put these kinds of things in dialogue with one another. As a person whose natural way of reading literature is historical, that's the way that I read them. I read literature generally anyway, similar to you. I often was really frustrated in MFA program with like, I realize the author's dead and stuff, but like having the author's context really helped me get what he's trying to say, even though I completely agree with Stanley Fish that that's not the only thing I can read here. It would be helpful to know what the author thought, or what, if you don't want me to say the author, what the discourse community thought 200 years ago when they were approaching these texts. Like, that actually really does help me make meaning of the text. So, and I think about you talk about even recently, this is not within my lifetime, but Peace is a book filled with history that, while all 20th century for the most part, I think first time I read that book, I didn't have the context for it. Like, I was not thinking about how different like a 1930s, 1920s, 1910s America was from even a 1960s, 1970s America. Particularly when you get beyond like the Leave It to Beaver vision of that world. And that book really pushes you. I mean, like there's even offhand references about like politics and suits and stuff that you guys picked up too, that I'm like, yeah, when I first read that book, I never figured that out at all. Like it was, I had no idea what that was referring to. And I do think it's easier for people now because, you know, I have to put myself back into my high school brain. I'm probably about your age, maybe a little younger. And I still, when I went and did research in high school, we were still operating on microfiche. And you actually had to really try to find stuff. And it is good to remind people that, like, yeah, there's only been about like, I don't know, 15 years where we've had the access to any reference at all times on a phone that I could look up anywhere. And it is interesting to remind myself of that, because sometimes it does feel like there's entire discourse patterns that are lost. There's also weird stuff, historical oddities, like if you grew up between the 50s and the 80s, you thought that quicksand was an ongoing problem.
It's so true. Yeah. Yeah. I've been gravely disappointed to never encounter quicksand on any hikes I've ever gone on.
I've encountered sinking mud, but that's the closest thing, and it doesn't work like quicksand does. So I'm just like, where is this quicksand that can suck us all under? And it's funny because it's a very specific obsession, because if you talk to kids, they have no idea what the hell I'm talking about now. I'm just like, no, but we all thought, like, you went into the desert, there's quicksand, you're going to die. Like,
yeah, not even just the desert, just like around the block. It really could be anywhere. I didn't understand why people had sandboxes in their yards. Like, what, you fools, you know?
And so, like, even trying to figure out what the obsessions, the pop cultural obsessions and motifs are, is both, it's easier to do now. I mean, because we just talk about the internet, but we often don't think about doing it, because I'm always like, well, why is this coming up? What's going on in the 70s that's bringing this particular thing out, or what's going on in the 40s that's bringing this particular thing out? Why are all the 50s movies about giant insects? Like, other than technology, and it was easy to do, or easy-ish to do. You know, why in the 70s are there movies about radioactive killer bunnies? Like, what's causing that? Like, and similarly about now, like, why is every third horror movie some weird pagan folk horror? Like, what's up with that? Or 80s slasher movies or whatever. And like, those are easier for people because I think more people know those tropes. But you just go back a little bit, like 60s sci-fi movies are wild. Like, they are wild compared to now because their tropes are not tropes we often recognize.
Yeah, the pre-Star Wars films, right? So the landscape there was wide open. It hadn't been sort of narrowly defined the way that that Star Wars then did that, where every science fiction movie for 20 years was attempting to at least have one foot in the Star Wars door at the very least. But I would 100% read a book on the cultural history of quicksand.
Yeah, me too.
I would love to know, like, where, can we find the earliest instance of that, and why did that get such cachet? And I would 100% read that book. I don't know that anyone's doing a dissertation on that right now or a monograph, but I hope someone is.
So what have you found, like, so get back to Elder Signs, what have you been most surprised by making the show? Like, what has really surprised you?
Well, the the non-intellectual answer is how much work it is.
Yeah,
That's
well, sure.
audio editing. I think if we had known ahead of time how much time we were going to spend on that and all everything that's involved in loading a podcast onto the internet and so on, I'm not sure we would have gotten started. So I'm glad we didn't know. But intellectually, I'm surprised. I guess all the time. Surprised by every story that we read in some way, and that's been a real joy for the show. But I think that for me, probably the biggest thing that I have gotten from the biggest intellectual gain, I guess, that I have gotten from doing the show has been to chart the things that people are afraid of over the course of time, even though we are, jumping around from between time and place all the time. It's been really interesting to see, what are the fears and anxieties of, this generation, and then where does that stop happening? Like, where does the quicksand start? Where does it end? And in particular, I've been really interested in charting environmentalism as
Mhm.
an interest. And environmentalism is something that Gene Wolfe is very passionate about. This is one of these places where, in terms of political ideology, he's very difficult to pin down. But I've been interested then in seeing that in other writers as well. And in fact, Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft actually both have some really interesting environmental concerns, uh, looking at prehistoric Earth and looking at ecological change over time and speculating about how that change shaped the development of species and maybe shaped the development of alien visitors on the planet and that sort of thing, has been really interesting. Looking as well at the even the things that you brought up, like giant insects, or insects at all, being afraid of insects as a type of horror, but then, yes, everything becoming gigantic because of radiation. The history of Malthusian fears, the fear of the Malthusian trap, being center stage in speculative fiction, in horror and science fiction in the 19th and the early and mid 20th centuries in particular, has been really interesting. And then all of a sudden it's just gone. This doesn't show up as an anxiety that people have anymore. And then of course we can see a big shift across speculative fiction in people's environmental concerns when it transforms from being about pollution to being about climate change. And how does that affect the things that we're afraid of and the scale and scope of things that we're afraid of? And that's very interesting, right? Those all those giant bugs, that's all wrapped up in the pollution fear, right? That something got on, this colony of ants, and now they're giant sized and they're going to eat us all. Even worse, they're gonna carry us down the tunnels into their giant lairs for the queen to eat or something like that. But those are not the concerns. Those are not the types of horror stories that we get from people who are concerned about climate change, for example, where climate change feels much more like a Lovecraftian cosmic horror, where it's such a big problem, and it's just not. Even if we can identify what are some things that could ameliorate uh, the consequences, the effects of this, how do we implement that becomes, such a problem. We don't know how. We don't know who's in charge because no one's in charge around here. And so there's a real sense of helplessness when we read stories that are dealing with climate change that we don't find in stories where, pollution is the big ecological issue, where, you can find the thing that is polluting and stop it. You can find the mad scientist who is coming up with the ray that's going to do dangerous things to the environment and stop that person, and so on. And so the charting those things over time has been real interesting.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I was thinking about one of your readings of one of my favorite novels of the aughts, which is The Wind Up Girl, by Paulo Baglicalupi.
Bacigalupi, I think, is how that's pronounced.
Bacigalupi, yeah. That's the word that I spell, a name that I used to spell all the time and would avoid saying. And I know two of his works. I have The Water Knife. I don't think I've read it, but The Wind Up Girl, and then his collection of short stories, which was, it was interesting, for example, because I don't know if you've seen the most recent Cronenberg movie. I don't know if you have time to watch anything outside of show production anymore. You have a kid, and thus that, I don't imagine you have much time at all anymore. But it's actually interesting because some of the same concerns about like human evolution, humans evolving to eat plastic in response to climate change, show up in the Cronenberg movie. They also show up in these stories from Baglicalupi about 15 years ago, 16 years ago, somewhere around there. Maybe 17 years ago. I'm getting old. But it's interesting to see. And I also feel like, interestingly, while it was kind of a backdrop in cyberpunk of the 70s and 80s, it really isn't there in the way that you'd expect. Like, and it's interesting to think about that because in the early 70s, like new sci-fi weird movement, like you read early J.G. Ballard or whatever, he's totally obsessed with that. And then you read stuff in the 80s and it's like barely mentioned at all. I find that very interesting. In fact, in some ways, and this is not necessarily flattering, but in some ways, like there's more stories about like Islamic terrorism in cyberpunk stories in the 80s than there are about climate concerns.
Yeah, cyberpunk is such a fascinating genre. It's one that I was just super into in the early 1990s, my high school years, and my co-host on our Neil Gaiman show, Brent Held, that he and I are high school friends, and wow, we just spent so much time reading Bruce Sterling and William Gibson and so on and so on. Strangely, cyberpunk is probably the one subgenre of all speculative fiction that we have not covered anywhere on the network, which is very strange given our proclivities. But I've been doing some just personal reading for fun, kind of revisiting cyberpunk, and yeah, was surprised to find exactly what you're saying, that these writers had a lot of things right about what the world looks like now. Power of corporations, in serfdom of all people, but also just enough circus to make us think we like it. And they really had their finger on the pulse there. But yeah, very little about environmentalism, very little about corporations as purveyors of the destruction of our planet's ability to continue to sustain life as we understand it, or our lifestyles as we understand it. Just isn't there. That wasn't the thing that they were concerned about in terms of corporations developing too much power, of turning open societies into blatant plutocracies and so on. And I look forward to trying to engage with cyberpunk on the air a little bit more.
One thing that, to speak similarly, you did this massive undertaking with Mountains of Madness for your Patreon feed. I know this is Patreons only, but it was huge. And one thing that your historian training really helped me grok was the specific scientific understanding that Lovecraft was pulling from, because he actually was, even though he gets a lot of stuff wrong, pulling from fairly cutting edge science and archaeology and anthropology of the early 20th century that, like, I think most modern readers would not catch was at all like viable. And I have to remind myself, oh yeah, we didn't really know that much about like the polar regions in the 1920s. Like it seems like we would by then. I mean, we're only like 40 years off from being in space, but yet we really didn't.
I mean, even just saying that is kind of a crazy thing, right? To think that just how quickly we developed technology in the first half of the 20th century. The 20th century really was the century of physics, right? Our ability
Mhm.
to do amazing things with highly sophisticated machines is really cool. I mean, it's really, really exciting. But yeah, I think it's so easy to if you're writing science fiction, which is to say you're writing fiction about science and scientists, the people who do science, and part of what you do there is to be cutting edge. You read scientific journals and find people's research interesting and find a way to turn it into an exciting story in some way or another. And that's certainly what Lovecraft was doing. But that is a move that just doesn't work 100 years later. People will have forgotten that this was cutting edge, or just will think that your story is incredibly ridiculous because the whole premise of it is just patently absurd, because you don't remember that for 10 years people actually thought that this was probably the answer to this question or something like that. And so it is fun to put your historian hat on and go back and try to think about it in those terms. And Lovecraft really was just phenomenal at keeping up with these journals, and he was all over plate tectonics before that became an accepted, or really the consensus view about how the geology of our planet has been shaped and continues to be shaped. He was on top of that, and it's very, very cool.
Yeah, it is interesting. I recently was going back and reading Edgar Rice Burroughs and reminding myself that this was not absurd at the at the beginning of the 20th century the way it feels now. It's slightly absurd, but it was not nearly as far fetched as it seems to us now. And again, that's only 120, 130 years ago, so people are not really thinking that the knowledge gap would have been that severe. Um, I mean, there are the ways that this obviously shows up. Like, go watch any movie about the deep future from the 70s, and then you wonder why everything's gone on green screen. Like, just all of their imagination, what computers are and what technology is basically like a mixture of slight computing and then like hydraulics. Um, and so, I mean, that's its own study now, like the study of like retrofuturism, like the study of what people thought the future was going to be in the past. But it's interesting I think you kind of have to approach a lot of science fiction and weird fiction like that. I think one of the most interesting things you guys have covered, and I think it's been available. When did you guys do the House on the Borderlands by William Hope Houghton?
Oh yeah, House on the Borderlands is available on Elder Sign. That might have been the first summer of the pandemic. That might have been 2020. I mean, who can keep track of time anymore?
Yeah, it was I listened to it twice, so I figured it was available. So uh I was going through that book is weird.
Yeah.
I went back and reread that book after you guys did it on the show, and I was like, no, this is even weirder than I thought it was. But it's also hard to figure out what's a truly weird element in that book, and then what is like just kind of semi-plausible in the time period speculative fiction. Like, what did people think about the idea of dimensions back then? I'd be interested in our cultural history is when we started positing what alternate dimensions were in non-religious language. Like, I have no idea when that started. I figure it's got to be sometime in the 19th century, but I don't know. So
Yeah,
um
I don't know either. I think my guess would probably be that uh, H.G. Wells. I think the time machine was, again, the time machine. Even just the idea of time machine is something we take for granted. We take for granted you can put it in a DeLorean, and but that was a revolutionary idea when Wells came up with it, and the idea that thinking of the future or the past for that matter, but especially the future as sort of another place that you could go to, you could travel to in a machine, the way that you can travel across space in machines like automobiles and trains and or just wagons and or on your own feet and so on, was totally revolutionary. And I suspect that probably the success of the Time Machine, if not the origin point of that, was probably an important moment in the spread of that type of speculative fiction. And House on the Borderlands actually feels very much like the Time Machine in
Mhm.
a number of respects, and is hot off the, maybe not hot off the heels, but it's in the same generation as Wells, and so is was clearly influenced by it. Though House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson, a huge commercial flop, unfortunately. Though easy to see why. It's a weird book. I enjoyed the heck out of reading that book. I enjoyed doing those episodes, but it's hard to see that as a beach read the way that you could take Time Machine to the beach.
The one thing I would say about reading a lot of this early sci-fi and weird fiction, and we also need to remind people that in the 19th and early 20th century, these genre distinctions kind of don't exist. Weird fiction includes a lot more than horror and gothic fiction because it was basically a catch-all for a certain category of the pulps, and um, some of that pulp stuff is very sword and sorcery. Some of it's very conventional horror. Some of it's wild. I will say this: your podcast and the Appendix M podcast has been really informative for like pinning down what we don't like. How much of our reading habits have been codified by marketing that is limited genres for sale, and it's interesting to read a lot of, or particularly early 20th century fiction, because those genres do not exist in the same way. Like there's all kind of like, and even Star Wars in a way kind of baffles it, because Star Wars is clearly like part Dune, part well, it's like Dune plus Lucas's views of the Vietnam War plus some stuff from not Buck Rogers. Flash Gordon is in there. Like it's interesting because Star Wars is sui generis, but it's mainly sui generis because it copies so many different things. But then you go back to a lot of fiction from that time period. I mean, even Frank Herbert pre-Dune, like The White Plague, that stuff is weird, and it's not easily genre definable in the way that we think of now. It's just not. And I find that fascinating. And then you find authors like Gene Wolfe who get away with not being genre categorizable, basically from sheer force of personality and strength of being in the field for so long. But what I find interesting is I used to think that was like super cutting edge and weird, and now I'm just like, no, that was actually kind of the norm before we started figuring out marketing niches. So
Yeah,
been,
the invention, or really the transformation of genre into into these publishing categories was, I don't. It's easy to rue. I think, especially, I think if you yourself are a writer, a creator, it's easy to rue the creation of those categories getting pigeonholed, or just finding that there is no market for the thing that you're doing because it doesn't fit easily in any of these publishing categories. I can see a lot of, there's grounds for a lot of angst there, but I I also would be interested in thinking about the pro side of, the benefits of creating these publishing categories where you get a special section of the library, a special section of the bookshop in particular, I guess, if it's, you're thinking about it in terms of a business, where you can just slap that publishing category label on it, put a cover on it that suggests, where within this publishing category this story is going to fit, and you've got an audience that doesn't need to think a whole lot more about whether or not they want to purchase it, or especially magazines off the news rack and so on, is an interesting move. I mean, it's certainly a very clever marketing move, but it does, to me, feel bizarre. Like, this is not something that we had ever really had before in literature. I mean, the idea of genre used to mean, what meter of poetry are you working in? How
exactly.
many syllables are in your verse lines, and that's really all it meant. Not like what is the topic or anything like that. And it really is fun to go back and look kind of pre World War II, when publishing was just so open. And, in the process of inventing these things, the pulp magazines were a big part of how these got invented. I mean, the names of these pulp magazines were just real simple things like detective stories. Like, that's it. This is a magazine that has detective stories. Like detective stories? We've got 8 of them in here. Yeah, buy it today. It keeps you busy on the train, train ride to work the whole week. Weird tales, amazing stories, astounding stories, all these, just putting the name of what they do actually is the name of the magazine. Was a real cool world, but it's also interesting that just, those things were still being worked out. And so all of these magazines would publish across the different genre publishing categories, without really, even giving a whole lot of thought to it, I don't think. And uh, there's a part of me that wishes we would go back to that. Of course, we've gotten more and more niche in the way that we get access to media, our screen media all through streaming, even, our print media coming through electronic reading devices so often. It would be nice just to have like more publications that are just it's an editor and it just says, I'm going to publish stories I like. I don't care what publishing category they're in. And if you want variety, this is a thing that maybe you could come to. I'd like to see more streaming TV shows like that as well. I mean, there's probably a reason I'm not working for Netflix. That's probably a terrible idea for their business model. But I think there is something to be gained by revisiting the world of 110 years ago, the publishing world of 110 years ago or so.
What I find interesting about this concept of genre is genre, I think in the 90s started getting so specific that it actually started doing that to itself by accident. Like, I mean, like, I think about like stuff like Slipstream or the resurgence of weird fiction actually seems to be part of this problem, because it's like, and that I really feel like that kind of came back into preference in the to prevalence in the aughts, because it was like, well, what do you do with these stories? Like, is H.P. Lovecraft sci-fi or horror or both or neither? I mean, I think both. And one of the things that I realized is how much effect he had on the culture in indirect ways. When I started thinking about like stuff like, oh, I think he's the first person who posited ancient aliens. Like, I don't know that there's anyone before him that's positing that. And I feel like the History Channel owes him a paycheck.
Yeah, a lot of
But,
royalties.
It's just like, I'm like, okay, Mountains of Madness, this is ancient aliens, man. I mean, but it is, Lovecraft's aliens also come before our ideas about aliens are codified. So they're so weird that we don't, that they're not like, they don't obviously fit like 50s, alien invasion tropes. And, they're pre our ideas about saucers and spaceships. So those are not really clearly part of it either. But it's interesting that, we have these genre limitations, they hit walls and these old things come back because, I think you guys are going to be covering Prometheus on the Patreon soon. You probably already recorded it, but it's that I didn't realize it until about the middle of rereading Out the Madness of Madness, and I was like, oh, this is why this movie being made is why we didn't get the Guillermo del Toro Mountains of Madness, because it's basically the same movie. Like, I didn't realize that Aliens is more or less in its conception a Lovecraft story.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Yeah, the movie's a mess. Yeah, we did record. It's coming out soon, so we did already record that. I will spoil it a little bit for you and just say, yeah, our consensus was this movie's a mess. Though I think we also both immensely enjoyed watching it again, and maybe in particular subjecting our wives to it.
how did, I Prometheus is a movie that bugs me because I think part of it actually is kind of brilliant, and then it seems overcut, or they couldn't agree on something, or it was too ambitious for the hour limitation or something. Like, it's because I agree with you, it's a mess. It's an objectively not a great movie, but it's also a movie that I've been thinking about since I saw it 10 years ago, even though I
Yeah,
don't think it's particularly good. It's one of those, and you're like, well, it can't be totally bad if I'm still pondering it like a decade later. So Yeah, but then I was like, oh yeah, it's the Mountains of Madness. It's just in space. Like, like that was Ancient Aliens. Got it. Now I'm Shoggoths. Got it. Like,
Yeah, Lovecraft is utterly foundational to science fiction, perhaps even more actually than he is to horror. And of course, you're right. He was writing at a time when those categories didn't really exist in any distinction, and he was each of them. He was also both of them, and yeah, Lovecraft, of course, died tragically young, didn't of a disease that really would have been avoided if it hadn't been for his poverty, because he was very much underappreciated in his own time, yet uh, essentially invents whole publishing categories for us, and uh, of course also never had any children or anything, but his estate is owed a lot of royalties. We could put that in a library fund or something.
yeah, it's interesting. I think about him and Poe, who both die young, and uh, Poe's not quite as underappreciated during his own lifetime, but uh, didn't have the money you'd expect a writer of his caliber to have, and you definitely see that with Lovecraft too. I think, knowing a lot about Lovecraft's biography, I'm always like, sometimes maybe you should have not helped as many authors and maybe made money for yourself, because he was doing rewrites for people for like very little money and not asking for a lot of credit. And I think people don't know that about. Well, I think people who are Lovecraft fans know about his work, but I don't think the general public realizes. Oh yeah, there's all kinds of stuff that Lovecraft wrote. Some of it we don't even attribute to him because he like wrote it under somebody else's name, or he took somebody else's idea and wrote a story for them, and then said they could publish it under their own name. Uh, and then there's like all the people he launched in his little fanzine culture. I mean, we got as Block is a major one. I mean, it's fascinating. And then you have all the people that Lovecraft has, and I think it's specifically the obsession with Lovecraft that got people looking back at authors like Arthur Mack and Algernon Blackwood in the United States, because I feel like they would have kind of been forgotten in the U.S. otherwise. I can't speak to their reception in contemporary Britain. I imagine that would not be the case there, but it's interesting how much like that just hits that one essay on horror fiction like actually defines so much and so much of contemporary reading habits even. um,
Yeah, this is a huge thing about Lovecraft, right? He wrote this brilliant essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature, that really sets the standard for studying horror, studying weird fiction, and then also at the same time is really founding the genre, inventing so many of the concepts that we all take for granted, the tropes that we all take for granted. He's really paralleled in his own generation by Raymond Chandler, who does essentially the same thing with detective fiction. He invents so many of the tropes of detective fiction, and then also has this brilliant essay called "The Simple Art of Murder" about what it's all about. And then in fantasy fiction, we have Tolkien, who is inventing at least what epic high fantasy looks like, and also then has a brilliant lecture or essay on what exactly fantasy literature is. In fact, has several of them on fairy stories is one that I'm thinking of. Though the monster and its critics, which is really a work of scholarship about Beowulf, actually still also outlines a lot of what is fantasy fiction there. All doing this work really in the 1930s as this sort of moment in which our genres are being founded, but also being solidified into publishing categories by these three giants, and all of them or maybe, well, to different degrees, didn't, I think, get the acclaim and remuneration that probably they were due. Chandler, the most successful of all of them, though, tragically just severely alcoholic. But, Tolkien made hardly any money on sales of the Lord of the Rings. He never even really made a lot of money on selling the film rights. He sold them very expediently for a very low amount of money because his family simply needed money you know, to have housing as he was retiring from Oxford, where they, used to live for free, and so didn't have any wealth accumulated in property ownership the way that, like the American economy is built on, for example, and just never got any remuneration from that, didn't feel like the Lord of the Rings had been, the massive success that we all recognized that it was, and those tragedies keep me up at night sometimes.
Uh, it's Tolkien reception is something I'm actually fascinated with because he explodes not in the period that he's alive, but really in the 60s and 70s is when and I think you see this even in if you're a hobbyist like me, you see like this big shift uh, from the people influenced by pre-70s sci-fi like Gary Gygax when he's designing D&D, so it's mostly sword and sorcery and not very Tolkien-esque. And then the people who come up just a little bit later, like the writers of Dragonlance, the Hickmans and Wise crew, and how much they, having grown up in the 70s, inject all this Tolkien-esque stuff that's a slightly later set of genre conventions. And now, I mean, like sword and sorcery and epic fantasy, you wouldn't think would be different genres, really, because like they're both epic, they're both fantasy, but they're defined by whether or not you're really pulling from a tradition of like Howard, some other people.
But
uh,
mostly Howard, yeah, I
but
mean,
mostly
Robert E.
Howard,
Howard is really the godfather of sword and sorcery for sure.
right? And then are whether or not you're pulling from Tolkien, but if like you read actually 60s and 70s fantasy, it's not actually as Tolkien influenced because Tolkien's breaking out at that time. So it's really like late 70s, 80s, and 90s fantasy that really defines that. And it's interesting to see these reception cycles, right? Um, and Tolkien's movies. I mean, my first experience with Tolkien's the old, I think, was it Rankin and Bass, the old cartoon ones.
Yep,
There's two,
that's it. Yeah, the
yeah,
Hobbit and the Return of the King.
right. And then I also watched the Ralph Bakshi weirdo Lord of the
Yeah.
Rings as a child. I think in the mid '80s on a very very overused VCR tape. Uh, um, when I'm actually probably the early '90s. I don't think I had a VCR in there mid '80s. Now I think about it, but Tolkien's been kept that actually kind of ever fresh as the intellectual property, partly because of the success of the Peter Jackson films, and partly because of the profound influences it later has on things like D&D. And even stuff like the way these genres interact is interesting. Like your show does more than just literature, because I think you do have to kind of increasingly look and like I think any modern speculative fiction writer is in dialogue not just with all other written speculative fiction, but definitely with TV shows and with movies now. And I think that can't be missed, actually, about how like, and there's little things about that. Like, for example, how much word processing makes movie like cuts easier to do for writers. And I don't think people realize how big, as a person who was taught to type on a typewriter in the early 90s, because we were still doing that, and then got on a word processor by the late 90s when all the typewriters went away. I don't think people realize how much that changes revising. Like if
Yeah.
you grew up all if you're maybe a millennial or younger, it's just like it's hard to forget. Like you used to have to rewrite everything when you revised. Like um,
Yeah,
and
and you
I
had that special material that you could put over something that you typed, like, that so that you could type over it again, whiteout, right? I mean, that's like
yes.
people don't even know what that means when if you say that to to them now. Yeah, it was a crazy world, and uh, thinking about just my own writing, both my fiction writing and my academic writing, just how frequently I sort of hover, just sit back as the cursor is blinking in the middle of a sentence and think, no, you know what, the grammatical subject of this sentence is wrong. Let me just rewrite that. I'll just I'll swap it out. The object needs to become the subject, vice versa. Bam, done. A typewriter, yeah, you couldn't do that, and I do frequently wonder just how the mental discipline of writing anything was so different because of that technology. We're afforded the ability to be sloppy. We're also afforded the ability to be perfectionists. And yeah, 30 years ago, that wasn't, or certainly 40 years ago, that was not really possible. And I just, every time I think about that, I feel like that would be the real nightmare if I accidentally traveled back in time to, I don't know, the Enchantment Under the Sea dance or something like that, would just actually be the lack of word processing software. I would just give up writing anything.
Yeah, I often think about that. When I was coming up in high school was when local newspapers were abandoning using physical blocks and moving to one of the publisher programs that they used. And I thought I was going to be a journalist, like a lot of people. That was a mistake, but I guess I kind of ended up one indirectly anyway. Um, but yeah, it was interesting to watch because I used to go and intern as a high schooler when I was doing the student newspaper, and I was also involved in zines and the shops, and like we were using word processing programs, and stuff, but we could still see the old cut boards. Like they hadn't even got rid of them, like they didn't use them anymore, but they hadn't thrown them away yet. And it was like it's weird to think about how different publishing was. And I go back and look at, like, I don't know, you know, I think we're both, or at least interested in the world of world playing. I also don't play that much, but I still collect and read the books. Um, uh, but like going back and looking at early D&D books and reminding myself, oh yeah, they didn't fix this shit, because like this is literally something they physically typed out. They had to mimeograph. Like the publishing standards for a booklet like that were probably still being produced in ways that we would find archaic. And if they were moving stuff around, they were literally taking an X-Acto knife, cutting it out and moving it, like, and doing paste boards. Like, oh, no wonder these are poorly laid out. Like, it would have been impossible, and it's impossible to expect that. But it's funny that, like, you forget, because that's not that long ago. That's only 40 years ago. That's in both mine and your lifetime. Like,
Yeah.
it's interesting how much that changes things. And I often think about it when I read all these very wordy writers, and I'm like, am I just responding to this because I'm in an era of it's real easy to fix stuff and it's real easy to cut stuff out, whereas like, I've written this long sentence, and if you want me to rewrite the story again to fix it, no, like, I'm just not going to do it another time. Like, yeah, I mean, also the amount of physical labor that goes into that used to go into that is actually kind of interesting to think about. Even I think even a movie like, say, Misery by Rob Reiner, about, off the Stephen King, makes that obvious, because you're just like, that whole plot doesn't matter now, because it, like, a computer and a cell phone takes care of that entire movie. Like,
Right.
like, so it's just, it's just torturing an author for months to get him to write a new ending to a novel would not be necessary anymore. It's just
No, and these days, I mean, you could just write your own alternate ending, and there's a whole fan community out there that's ready to read that and treat that as their headcanon. And yeah, a lot fewer abductions and tortures now that we've invented online fan communities, I imagine.
true, fair. So I guess I wanted to spread some joy about some stuff I've gotten from your work before I let you go. I knew about Karen Russell. So for people to think, oh, it's all old stuff that they're talking about. No, yeah, on Elder Sign and Atos, you read very contemporary stuff. And like, I knew about Karen Russell, but your discussions of, I think, two of her stories, like, got me really interested in Karen Russell, because, I'm kind of jaded on MFA fiction, so I was not sure what that was going to be. And so it was interesting. And we talked about some old authors that I've found from you, and particularly from time periods that are kind of like forgotten about now, like the late 70s, early 80s. But like, Karen Russell's pretty contemporary. I believe those two books are what, like, in the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, she's writing now and is just phenomenal. She was not someone that I had read at all, and so this is another one of these places where listener engagement is just so important to what we're covering on the show, and just so personally rewarding for me. And yeah, I was thinking even about her actually when you were talking about teaching Shakespeare earlier. The first story of hers that we covered is called Black Corfu, and it is
mhm.
it's a weird fiction retelling of Othello in some ways, and uh, which was very cool to engage with that. It gave me an opportunity to go read Othello for the first time in a long time, and also just to think about how difficult it is to make sense of Othello and what is going on with the race elements or the skin color elements in the play. And I think Karen Russell, takes that story, takes that question, and writes a really great uh, zombie story out of it. It's very very cool.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story, and I was first exposed to it from you guys. Um, and then there's been some novel. I'm trying to think. Atos is I listen to a lot for novel suggestions. And there's a novel. I think it was a Devourer, the Destroyer.
Oh yeah, the Devourers
Yeah.
by Indra Das. That's a really cool werewolf story that takes place in early modern India. Again, that was brought to my attention by a listener. Beautifully written and just a. I, I don't tend to like werewolf stories. I think I even said that on the episode, but this really turned me around on that. I've been not giving them the credit that they deserve. It was just a masterpiece of a novel.
Yeah, actually, on werewolf stories, I like the Werewolf of Paris because it's way weirder than anyone thinks it is. And not actually all of our tropes don't come from the novels; they come from the movie. They come from
That's
the.
right, and they're just kind of schlocky, right? I mean, I think this is where werewolf stories go wrong. At least our contemporary werewolf stories go wrong. Is that they're taking all their cues from B movies.
Mhm. Yeah, basically, it's like the Universal horror movies, and then all the knockoffs after that from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that's pretty much it. And yeah, that the Devourers, that book sounded very interesting to me when you guys were covering it. Who else did I read off of Nesbit? Wasn't you guys? Nesbit was another show, but I use. So my main point is go listen to Elder Sign if you like weird or horror fiction, or even if you don't, honestly, because one of the things I think that you'll realize from listening to Elder Sign, I mean, like one of my favorite weird authors I know is not. I don't go tell everybody go read Thomas Ligotti because I don't think everybody's gonna like it's too much for a lot of people. But there's plenty out there. And then if you want to touch ATOS, there's so much out there. And I think one of the interesting things that you guys are doing for me is like you've covered a lot of like classic sci-fi that I have not touched and didn't like. For me, I always started like my sci-fi journey is like Asimov. We don't care. We don't care. We don't care. 70s. We kind of care about cyberpunk. There's some cool epic stuff in the 90s and aughts. Okay, now we care. But like because I associate like 50s sci-fi with this, with basically bad 50s movies,
Yeah.
honestly. And it's way more interesting, I think, than people realize, and it's a lot less set in stone. It's so if you want to explore that, I definitely would suggest your show for that. I always like when particularly I'm talking to non-political people. Not that you don't have a politics, but that's not what you're known for. I ask them to spread something they enjoy or I really like to my audience because we're in kind of interesting times, and I think people might need some positive stuff. So, and I'm kind of known as a prophet of doom in my publishing sphere, so I always try to like play against that stereotype. So, what would you like? What's some things that you think that you've encountered recently you think people would really like? And it could be from anything.
Yeah, maybe I'll give a few answers if you don't mind. I mean,
I'm
I
welcome.
mean, I read a lot and watch a lot, but actually, as you were saying that, Derek, the first thing that came to mind is something that my wife and I have been doing after we put our son to bed for the evening
Hmm.
to escape from the world essentially, and just sit on the couch next to each other and be near each other, but also not having to talk anymore after we've been teaching or podcasting all day, and having a toddler in a world without any kind of a daycare with family members all 1,000 miles or more away. Was We decided to watch Murder She Wrote from the 1980s. Just formulaic detective show, and I found it actually to be one of the most optimistic things I've ever watched. The worldview is that people are inherently good, though of course someone is murdered and someone murders in every episode. But the idea that Jessica Fletcher walks through the world thinking that people are inherently good. Uh, she is everyone in the show is civil and polite with one another, and even the theme song is just like the jauntiest tuba song you ever hear, and it just uh, for 2 years it was just a nightly thing that we did that brought us a lot of joy and let some of the cares of the outside world wash away for 45 minutes or so. And that is something that I would highly recommend, that totally off brand for anything that we've been talking about.
I weirdly I have a strange love of Angela Lansbury, which I think comes from the fact that she's been around for so long that I can just find interesting stuff she's done from like the 40s forward.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I think she's still kind of active. Weird. I mean, she's in her late 90s, um, but no, I grew up watching Murder She Wrote on reruns like as a kid because it was always on. And it's also a very well made show. Actually, I think people forget, because particularly in the 90s, episodic television got kind of lazy, but that some of these episodic shows are actually very well made. And yes, they have a format, and yes, that format can be like, you wonder what small town has, that many people getting murdered in it, while watching Murder She Wrote. But that show's remarkably good, and I think it actually holds up. Like, it's a show that I have actually revisited myself. It's funny that you bring it up because I'm like,
Yeah, yeah, we have found it to be remarkably good, and of course, we both remembered it from our childhood, though in our case, we both what we remembered was being shooed out of the room by our parents, as we weren't gonna be allowed to watch it when it aired on I guess it was Sunday nights, is my memory. But then I, also remember trying to sneak glimpses of this forbidden thing, of course, watching it now, like, why on earth would this have been forbidden to anybody? It's the
right.
most wholesome thing ever. I mean, even the murders are kind of wholesome in a strange way, but that's been a real escape for us. So that's probably the number one thing that I would recommend. But in terms of, I would love, of course, to have, well, anybody listening to our show and join in our conversations about stories. If I were to recommend a way in for people who are interested in politics, I would actually probably suggest the 3 or 4 episodes that we've done on China Mieville stories. China Mieville, of course, has run for office on particularly lefty platforms
Yeah,
in
he's a
the
British
UK.
Trotskyist. Yeah.
Exactly right. Yes, and we've done at least two of his stories on Elder Sign. Possibly we've done three, but I've also done one of his novels over on ATOS, and we hope to do more. And that's a place where we engage with politics because it's in his stories, and in some degree at least. And also, he's just an absolutely brilliant writer. Everybody should be reading China Mieville just for the pleasure of his prose, let alone the power of his ideas.
Yeah, I love what's that first novel series that he did? Um, I don't know. He wrote Desolation. No, I'm getting him and Ian McDonald confused. But I actually he wrote a children's book that I find really fascinating. um, so he's very interesting. I guess that would be a good entry point. I will also tout your series on the Fifth Head of Sybaris that you did on G Wolf, and uh, I think it's good. I would tell people to join the Patreon, because I thought your coverage of the Mountains of Madness was really good, and I say that because that's one of the most covered stories in this sort of. And so I was like, I don't know. what is it? What am I going to learn new from this? And I was like, no, I actually learned a lot, particularly because of historical contextualization of the science part that I had just not known. So I would, yeah, I would definitely suggest that. Is there any writer or anything that you haven't discussed in your show that you'd like to maybe
Oh,
put out
wow.
into the
Yeah,
world?
gosh, there must be a lot. Offhand, I'm failing to come up with one. Let me have a quick glance at the bookshelf here and just, see who pops out. Mm. Yeah, well, so yeah, there of course, there are lots of them. I just did a quick look. I mean, you even watched me do a quick glance at the bookshelves here, and, we've actually I guess we've covered a lot. We've done 500 episodes or so across the network, so we've done a lot of stuff. But actually, there's some pretty big names or big maybe not necessarily authors, but maybe big works that we haven't done. And one that I've been really eager to do the work on, to take a look at, is actually the very first A Song of Ice and Fire book, Game of Thrones, and revisit that. It's been 30 years since that book came out. It's gone through the massive popularity of the TV show, and this is a book that does a lot of things that I'm really interested in or inherently take some joy in. It's in a secondary world. That's something I always really like. Draws, I think, equally on the traditions of Tolkien and Howard, as we were talking about earlier, but it takes place, a lot of it takes place in a court setting, has religious institutions as well, and is also. Martin wrote this and published this at a moment when a lot of our political ideologies were shifting, but in particular at a moment when this was the moment when we were starting to shift our thinking about what environmentalism is that I spoke about earlier, and there is some cataclysmic stuff in this world that has to do with climate and weather, and so I would be really interested in going back and looking at the very first Game of Thrones book with my historian's hat on, trying to contextualize it in a lot of these strands that we talked about here on the show today. It's a big book, and haven't had the chance to do that yet, but I would really like to do that.
I was going to ask you, like, and then you bring that up. That's a book that pulls ostensibly, well, from the time period, I guess a little later than the time period that you studied, but it's um, what high Middle Ages would be technically, like when it's pulling as its analog. Because that's War of the Roses and this, that, and the other. How do you think? I mean, it's a proxy universe, so we should not compare. Like, we should not say that we should expect um, uh, George Mar- uh, George Martin to, I don't know, uh, totally reflect actual was 11th, 12th, and 13th century England. But how does it hold up from a historian standpoint? Um,
Yeah, this is a great question, and I can't really answer it very well because I have not read the book since I have watched the
mm,
TV show, right? Which is probably true for a lot of us. So I would have some trouble kind of drawing distinctions there. But I always was super interested in the book series, as it's really kind of Shakespeare fan fiction with some fantasy stuff thrown in, and that's an elevator pitch that will get my money and every time. But he also does draw on some really cool elements, really interesting elements of medieval Britain. And you're certainly right that what he's really doing is late medieval, 14th century and 15th century in particular. But his idea of the seven kingdoms united under one high king. There's this wall in the north, separating two peoples. All of that's actually really from early medieval English history or early medieval British history. The idea of there being seven Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and this position called the Bretwalda, which we might translate as High King. That's actually
mm,
not a thing that ever existed, but it appears in some of the literature as if some of the historical accounts, historical narratives, Bede, as who I mean, as if it's a real thing. And so Martin has taken that and made it a real thing in his world. And then, of course, the ice wall is, it's Hadrian's wall, and then he populates the ice wall with what is really a 12th century military order, which is a cool thing to do. And so, he's mashing up a lot of ideas or concepts from the Middle Ages, institutions from the Middle Ages as well, and then shoving it all in his fantasy version of Shakespeare fan fiction, which sounds like kind of a mess. And I want to go revisit it very badly and kind of tug on each of these things that I've mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was going to ask you how much of the history you think is actually informed by history, and how much of you think is informed by Shakespearean history plays. You
Yeah,
know,
it's way more Shakespeare than history, but actually a surprising amount of history. In fact, the another element that I think is really fun is the Targaryens, who unify the Seven Kingdoms, kinda develop this position of, what Bede would have called the Brett Walda. They come over on dragons, right? So that's our fantasy element, but they are the Normans. They're the Norman dynasty that comes over from Normandy, and they came over with dragon flags, right? That's the thing. That's how you knew they were the Normans, because they had these dragon flags, these dragon banners, and so, Martin has read something, I'm not sure what. That would be one of the interesting questions I would have in reading the books, would be to try to suss out what it is that he's actually read, what his bookshelves look like. But he's read something and said, "Okay, but what if they were real dragons?" And yeah, that's a great story prompt. What if they were real dragons?
yeah. When I saw Targaryen, I was like Plantagenet.
Yeah,
Like
100%. Yeah.
those words look real close. But yeah, it's fun. It's interesting because when I was reading that book, I when I first read that book, I think it was probably around 2002. And it was kind of getting notoriety as being like interesting. And this is in the late aughts where, I mean, early aughts, and into the late aughts where fantasy got really edgy. Um,
Yes.
I think people have now like forgotten, but I'm like, in my 20s, fantasy got really edgy. Like, um, and uh, but I found Martin more interesting than a lot of the other people writing it. Not because Martin's actually a great wordsmith. I actually don't think that he's a good character and world builder, but and he's not a bad wordsmith. It's not like I'm reading purple prose, but it's very workman, which is fine. But conceptually, it's quite interesting what all he's doing with. There's so many different ideas, and there's so many analogs to late 90s, early aughts politics too, that I think also kind of it's been lost now, because I'm like, yeah, part of this is clearly a metaphor about the Iraq war and about like thinking you're liberating people, like in a way that I think is already, even though that's not that long ago. I mean technically that word didn't until recently, but it's very much in the foreground of that book in a way that already feels very, very different. I Another thing recently, I originally rewatched the reboot of Battlestar Galactica,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
and realized also how much that show is rooted in two things. One, the shift from episodic television to serial television, because that show starts episodic and ends serially, and two, how much it's about very specifically like aughts, war politics. It's weird because at the time it felt very new, but like it already feels very, very much more than a lot of other stuff from the same time period of that decade and of that specific time, because when I'm not removed from problems of imperialism or whatever, but we are removed from that. Like, um, we're not having debates about torture right now. Like,
Yeah, I would love to revisit that show. I think, my memory of what happens in which season might be faulty, but I think the opening of the 3rd season, when they've been captured and are on another planet and have been subjugated by the Cylons, and all of our heroes have become members of a terrorist cell. Uh, I watched that while I was a civilian working for the military,
mm,
as that was airing live, and that was provided such fodder of conversation for us at work, which is actually those conversations at that job are the origin of our podcast network. And just that was, to me, that was the most thoughtful response to 9/11 and the ensuing wars that I've seen in any medium. Just absolutely brilliant. And I would love to revisit that in a real purposeful way someday. I ask you, have you been watching Ronald Moore's current show that's on Apple? It's For All Mankind, the alternate history about the space program and how what might have happened if the Russians had beaten us to the moon.
No, I haven't, but that sounds fascinating.
Yeah,
That is like
I would love to watch it and do an episode or two on it. So if you're taking requests.
all right. I actually might actually that might be worth doing. I have a deep fascination with the Soviet space program, and actually, the U.S. space program, including like. I know why this prompts conspiracy theories now, because there's stuff that we've forgotten how we did. Like, I actually was reading that because of the technology that we stored a lot of the shuttle data on, we'd have to retro engineer the shuttles, like the shuttles. I mean, not the shuttles, the original big crafts and the early rockets. We don't even totally have all that information. They kept it on, like, I guess five and a quarter floppies.
Oh, wow. Huh.
And we've lost it. Like
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not even that old. We've lost. So when people talk about how like science fiction is like, oh, we won't lose technology, I'm like, no, we've lost technology like recently. We just have other technology and we're not really focusing on that. But like, it's sometimes hard to reproduce stuff that we invented years ago. And I remember realizing this. I mean, this is a weird tangent, and I'll let you go after this. But when I was in Egypt, all right, I remember going and looking at Islamic architecture, and it was gorgeous. But there was all these pillars, and they were all stolen from Greek and Egyptian pagan temples. And the reason why is because in the Egyptian Middle Ages, they had forgotten, even before the Arab conquest, how to make those pillars. Like, they could no longer do it. And so, and I was fascinated by that, because I'm like, some of the technology that they had in medieval Egypt was actually much better than ancient technology. And yet it took them, I think, like 500 years to retro-engineer how to remake those specific kinds of pillars. It's fascinating to me that kind of stuff happens, but it very much happens. Like, and it's not even like when a society like completely goes, rise and collapse of civilization. It can happen with fairly continuous civilization and still fairly high levels of technology. You just forgot how to make a component, like. And so the people were just going around stealing pillars out of other temples, like to put up mosques, because it's just really weird. You're in these beautiful Islamic mosques, and they're incredible inlay, and a lot of it's from the period. But then you have like, why are there these Greek and why is there a mixture of Greek and ancient Egyptian columns everywhere? Like, oh, you didn't know how to make pillars. What? You knew how to do water wheels. You knew how to, like, the nilometer existed. You were a pretty advanced culture, but you forgot. Yeah. So similar with apparently parts of the space program, we have lost we don't really know exactly how they made it. We may have a good idea, but I don't want to make it sound like we couldn't. I mean, obviously we still send stuff in space all the time, but some of those engineering feats, we don't exactly know how they go, because we let the data go bad.
Right. Yeah. I mean, bit rot's a real thing that we need to be concerned about. But I think there's a real parallel to both of these instances that you're thinking about here, which is that in both cases, the technology being used was secretive. The people who were using it needed to keep it secret. The ancient, or really just the pre-modern world in general, specialized labor was specialized because it required knowledge, and there were institutions, organizations of the people who did those jobs, in this case, masons, and who kept the real serious business secrets of how they did what they did, well, secret, so that they would have value, that they could command high rates for their labor. And you had to work a long time for a stonemason before you yourself would be allowed to know the secrets. And this was true for most of these, really like artisan and crafts person type jobs. But of course, NASA, classified space program. So it's not like people could be taking those plans home and being like, yeah, like I engineered the lunar lander for the Apollo missions. I'm pretty proud of that work. I'm going to take a copy of the blueprints home to have on my, no, you'd be in jail if you did that.
Mhm.
Right. So it all had to be, kept secret in some way. So there was not this dissemination of information, the sort of thing that, of course, we all take for granted now. I mean, I think anything goes wrong with my home or my car, even though I don't know how to do any of that, YouTube's going to teach me how to do a real bad job of repairing that thing myself. But we just, that's new. That's brand new in the world.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I had not thought about the fact that that would all have been carteled knowledge, but you're right, it would have been. I wonder if just like the guild died in some war, like
Yeah, I don't know the specific reasons behind why that happened. I'm not an art historian, but yeah, I would now I want to know more about it. And someone probably has written something about the demise of this type of pillar technology in late antiquity.
yeah, it's late antiquity is a fascinating thing. A fascinating thing to study. Last question. This brings up an example of this in literature that is one of I think a book you said was one of your favorites, at least before you started the show, and that's A Canonical for Lieberowitz. As a medieval historian, what do you think of that book, and how do you think it's hold up?
Yeah, love that book. Again, that was a book I got to cover on ATOS thanks to a listener. I was so grateful for that. That book is amazing. Yeah, so I had read that book long before I went to do an education in medieval history, then revisited it after having earned all my degrees and learned Latin and so on. And I found it held up masterfully in terms of being a post-apocalyptic retelling of medieval history as a series of time hopping novellas. It gets some of the big strokes of the different phases of the Middle Ages right, plays with them in some really fun and really interesting ways. It's an absolute masterpiece of world building. It is certainly a classic of post-apocalyptic and even just apocalyptic speculative fiction, but also it is one that engages with several different really interesting moral questions. One of them being should knowledge be free? Should we keep knowledge within the control of people who've been trained to use it in one particular way or not? And all sorts of other moral questions. And Walter Miller himself, a very interesting person. The book is, its big theme is war. Big fear is nuclear war. It is anti-war. It is anti-military, anti-militarization. Walter Miller was a bomber pilot in the Second World War, and his experiences in the Italian campaign just wrecked him. And that's a large part of what this book is about. He couldn't go home again. He was one of these veterans who couldn't go home again and be comfortable. And this book was part of how he got through that. He also had a very supportive partner who helped him a lot. But so there's a lot of different reasons, a lot of excellent reasons to read this book. So this is one I also would just highly recommend to your listeners.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show. We love to always talk culture stuff here. Just so our listeners can know where to find you, where they can find Claytemple Media and your various podcasts.
Yeah, so you can find the network and all the podcasts at claytemplemedia.com, just straight to our website. You can also find us on Twitter. The network is just at Claytemple Media. I'm at GL McDorman. Twitter's a place where we're actually fairly active if you ever just want to chat with us about something you've read, an episode you've listened to, or just anything you're thinking about. Love to hear from you.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on. Have a great day.
Derek, thanks for having me. You as well.